Welcome to Bible Story Time for Kids. Hi there, little ones and parents. We're so excited to have you here at Bible Story Time for Kids, where the amazing stories of the Bible come to life just for you. Each story is not only exciting, but also filled with important lessons about faith, kindness, and love. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so you'll never miss out on the next exciting adventure. Imagine standing on a dusty battlefield, the sun blazing down from the clear blue sky, the sound of clanking armor echoing through the valley. On one side, the mighty Philistine army stands tall, their armor shining in the sun, their faces filled with pride and confidence. And in front of them, towering over everyone else, is Goliath, a giant of a man, standing nearly 10 feet tall, his armor thick as a fortress wall, and his sword gleaming in his hand. The Israelites, God's chosen people, stand on the opposite side, shaking in fear. No one dares to challenge this massive warrior. Goliath's booming voice fills the valley, mocking them, daring anyone to fight him. Every day for 40 days, he comes out and challenges the Israelites, but no one steps forward. Goliath is no ordinary soldier. He's the strongest, most fearsome warrior the Philistines have ever known. His armor alone weighs over 100 pounds, and his spear is so heavy that even the strongest men in Israel would struggle to lift it. Every time he steps forward, heavy footsteps shake the ground, and his voice booms across the valley like thunder. "Who will fight me?" Goliath taunts, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Who among you has the courage to stand against me?" But each time, the Israelites tremble, too afraid to face the giant. They know what's at stake. If Goliath wins, Israel will fall under Philistine control and they will be slaves. But no one believes they can defeat him. The entire Israelite army is frozen in terror. They know they can't defeat Goliath, not with his size, his strength, or his ferocity. Even King Saul, who was once the brave leader of Israel, looks on helplessly. This giant seems unbeatable. What could they possibly do against such an enormous foe? Now let's pause for a second. Imagine being in that army, looking up at Goliath. Would you be afraid? How could anyone possibly defeat someone so big, so powerful? Seemed impossible. And yet, what if I told you that a young shepherd boy, someone who wasn't even a soldier, would be the one to stand up to this giant? Would you believe me? This is the story of David and Goliath, a story of courage, faith, and trusting in God even when things seem impossible. But before we get to David, let's talk about what was happening in Israel. The Israelites were God's chosen people, and they had been through many ups and downs. They had seen God's power at work in their lives, from escaping slavery in Egypt to receiving the 10 Commandments. They had seen miracles and victories in battle. But now, they were facing a new challenge. The Philistines, a strong and fearsome army that wanted to conquer Israel. The two armies gathered in a valley to prepare for battle. But instead of fighting right away, the Philistines sent out their champion, Goliath, to challenge the Israelites. Goliath was unlike anyone the Israelites had ever seen. He was massive. His armor alone weighed more than most people could carry, and his spear was as thick as a weaver's beam. Every day he would come out, shouting insults at the Israelites and taunting them. "Why are you even here?" Goliath would shout. "Send someone to fight me. If he wins, we'll be your servants. But if I win, you'll be ours." 40 days this continued, and no one in Israel was brave enough to take on Goliath. It wasn't just that they were afraid. Goliath seemed unbeatable. No one wanted to be the one to face certain defeat. And day by day, the soldiers of Israel grew more and more discouraged. Even the bravest among them, men who had fought in many battles, felt powerless in the face of such a challenge. They knew that if they sent anyone against Goliath, it would mean certain death. The fear in the Israelite camp grew every day. King Saul, who had once been a strong and mighty warrior, didn't know what to do. He had led his people into many battles before. But this was different. Goliath wasn't just a warrior. He was a giant, a monster of a man. Saul felt helpless, and the soldiers felt even worse. Every day, they would hear Goliath's taunts, and every day, they would shrink back in fear. Morale was at an all-time low, and the Israelites were losing hope. Would God deliver them this time? But as the Israelites trembled in fear, God was preparing someone special, someone no one would expect. And that someone was David, a young shepherd boy from Bethlehem. David wasn't a soldier. In fact, he wasn't even at the battlefield when Goliath first appeared. David was the youngest of 8 brothers. And while his older brothers were soldiers in Saul's army, David stayed at home to take care of his father's sheep. But David wasn't just any shepherd boy. Even though he was young, David had a strong and unwavering faith in God. He spent his days watching over the sheep, and in those quiet moments, he had learned to trust in God's protection. David had already faced danger before. He had fought off lions and bears to protect his flock, and each time he had called on God for help. He knew that God was always with him, and no matter what challenge he faced, God would deliver him. Little did anyone know, God had been preparing David for this moment all along. While the soldiers looked to their weapons and armor for strength, David looked to God. The stage was set. Armies were ready. And soon, a young shepherd boy would face a giant that no one else dared to challenge. Now, let's meet the unlikely hero of our story, David. Far away from the battlefield, in a quiet, peaceful countryside, a young shepherd boy was tending to his father's sheep. This boy was not a soldier, nor was he known for his strength or battle skills. His name was David, the youngest son of Jesse from Bethlehem. While his older brothers were off fighting in King Saul's army, David spent his days watching over his father's flock. He might not have seemed like the type to stand against a giant, but David was special in other ways. David was not just a shepherd. He was a young man with an enormous heart and an even bigger faith in God. Each day, as he guided the sheep through the fields, he would pray and sing praises to God. He had a deep connection with God, and through that connection, David had learned something very important. He could trust God with everything. Whether it was finding water for the sheep or defending them from wild animals, David always knew that God was by his side. In fact, David had faced dangerous situations before. Even though he wasn't a soldier, there were times when lions and bears came to attack his flock, but David didn't run away. With only his staff and slingshot, David fought off those predators, confident that God would protect him. He knew that it wasn't his own strength that saved the sheep, but God's power working through him. Despite his bravery in the fields, David was still just a boy in the eyes of others. His family saw him as the youngest and least significant of Jesse's sons. His brothers, who were older, stronger, and already part of Saul's army, never imagined that David could do anything extraordinary. After all, they were the warriors, and David was just the shepherd boy. But God had plans for David that no one could see yet. While others may have overlooked him, God had chosen David for something great. And soon, David would step onto the battlefield in a way no one expected. One day, as David was watching over the sheep, his father Jesse called him inside. "David," Jesse said, "I need you to take this food to your brothers at the battlefield. They've been away for many days, and I want to know how they are doing." Jesse handed David some bread and cheese and instructed him to check on his brothers and bring back news. Without hesitation, David set off on the journey to the battlefield. Even though he wasn't a soldier, David was eager to serve his family. He had no idea that this trip would change his life forever. As David traveled to the Israelite camp, the sound of the soldiers preparing for war grew louder. The sight of the towering Philistine army and the sight of Goliath, the giant looming over the valley, was unlike anything David had ever seen before. When David arrived at the camp, he found his brothers and greeted them. "How are you?" "How is the battle going?" he asked eagerly, unaware of the fear that gripped the Israelite army. His brothers were surprised to see him there. "Why have you come here?" he questioned, frustrated by his presence. "You should be at home taking care of the sheep, not hanging around the battlefield." But as David spoke with them, something unexpected caught his attention. Goliath, the giant, was out again, shouting his usual taunts. David listened as Goliath mocked the Israelite army and challenged them to send out a warrior to fight him. David was shocked by what he heard, but even more surprised by what he didn't see. No one was stepping forward to fight the giant. No one was even responding to Goliath's insults. "Who is this Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David asked in disbelief. He couldn't understand why the entire army of Israel, God's chosen people, was standing still, afraid to act. David knew that with God on their side, they could face any enemy, no matter how big. His brothers, however, were embarrassed by his boldness. "You don't understand, David," they said. "This is Goliath. He's too powerful. No one can defeat him." But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. How could they allow this giant to mock God's people? Didn't they believe that God could help them? While everyone else saw an unbeatable giant, David saw an opportunity for God to show his power. He believed that God didn't need an army to defeat Goliath. He just needed one person with faith. David's words began to spread throughout the camp, and soon King Saul heard about the young shepherd's boldness. Saul summoned David to his tent. When David appeared before the king, Saul looked at him in disbelief. "You're just a boy," Saul said. "How can you possibly defeat Goliath? He's been a warrior since his youth, and you've never even fought in a battle." But David wasn't discouraged. He told Saul about how God had helped him defeat lions and bears while protecting his sheep. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine," David said with confidence. Saul listened, and though he still had doubts, he could see that David's faith was genuine. Saul finally agreed to let David face Goliath, though no one truly believed the young shepherd would survive the encounter. But David knew something they didn't. This battle wasn't about strength or size. It was about faith, and David's faith in God was unshakable. With that, David prepared to face the giant who had terrified an entire nation. With Saul's blessing, David left the king's tent, his mind filled with determination and faith. He walked through the camp. Soldiers gave him curious, doubtful glances. How could this young shepherd boy, with no armor and no experience, hope to defeat the mighty Goliath? But David wasn't bothered by their doubts. His confidence didn't come from his own ability, from his trust in God. David made his way to a small stream near the battlefield. He knelt down by the water and carefully selected 5 smooth stones, placing them in his pouch. These stones, along with his slingshot, were all he would take into battle. No heavy armor, no sword, just the simple tools he had used every day as a shepherd. To anyone watching, it seemed like David was walking into certain defeat. But to David, these stones were more than enough, because he knew that God would guide his hand. As David approached the battlefield, he could hear Goliath's voice booming across the valley once again. The giant was calling out his usual taunts, mocking the Israelites and their God. Goliath had been doing this for 40 days. Each time, the Israelite army had stayed silent, too afraid to answer his challenge. But today would be different. Today, David would step forward. The sight of Goliath up close was terrifying. The giant's massive body was covered in armor that gleamed in the sunlight, and his spear was like a tree trunk, thick and heavy. Goliath's shield-bearer stood in front of him, looking tiny in comparison to the enormous warrior. As David walked toward the battlefield, Goliath's mocking laughter rang out. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Goliath sneered when he saw David. To him, David looked like nothing more than a child. "Come here," Goliath said, "and I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." Philistine soldiers roared with laughter, amused by the idea that this small, unarmed boy thought he could challenge their greatest warrior. But David wasn't intimidated. He had faced danger before, and each time, God had protected him. This time would be no different. With a calm, steady voice, David called out to Goliath, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David's words echoed across the valley, silencing the Philistines' laughter. Continued, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. It is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hand." The boldness of David's declaration was shocking, not only to Goliath, but to the entire Israelite army, who had been watching from a distance. For 40 days, they had heard Goliath's taunts, but not once had they heard someone stand up to him. Such confidence. David's faith in God was clear, and his courage was unwavering. Goliath's expression turned from amusement to rage. He tightened his grip on his spear and began to move toward David, his heavy footsteps pounding the earth like thunder. The soldiers on both sides watched in tense anticipation. The Israelites held their breath. terrified of what would happen next. Could this young boy really defeat the giant? But David didn't flinch. As Goliath approached, David reached into his pouch and pulled out one of the smooth stones he had collected. With practiced ease, he placed the stone in his slingshot and began to spin it. The whirling sound of the sling cut through the air as David took careful aim. His heart was steady, his hands sure. He knew that God was guiding him. And then, with a sudden flick of his wrist, David released the stone. Time seemed to slow down as the stone flew through the air, heading straight for Goliath. The giant barely had time to react before the stone struck him square in the forehead. The impact was so powerful that Goliath staggered, his massive body swaying for a moment before he collapsed to the ground with a thunderous crash. The valley fell silent. The Philistine soldiers stared in disbelief as their champion lay motionless on the ground. The Israelites, too, were stunned. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. The giant, unbeatable warrior, had been defeated by a single stone. David stood over Goliath, looking down at the fallen giant. Without hesitation, he ran to Goliath's body, took the giant's own sword, and cut off his head, just as he had declared. The victory was complete. Goliath was defeated, and the Philistines' pride was shattered. The Israelite army erupted in cheers, their fear turning to triumph. They surged forward, chasing the fleeing Philistines, emboldened by David's victory. What had seemed impossible moments before had now become reality. David, a young shepherd, had defeated the mighty Goliath with nothing but a stone, a slingshot, and unwavering faith in God. As the Israelites pursued their enemies, David stood alone on the battlefield, holding Goliath's sword. It was clear to everyone that day that David's victory was not just his own. It was a victory for God, a demonstration of his power and faithfulness. David's trust in God had been rewarded, and his faith had made him the hero of Israel. As the dust settled on the battlefield and the giant Goliath lay defeated, David's actions reverberated through the ranks of both armies. The Philistines, stunned by the loss of their champion, began to retreat in fear. The Israelites, previously frozen with terror, erupted into cheers of triumph and surged forward in pursuit of their enemies. What had seemed like an impossible challenge had now become a glorious victory, all because one young shepherd dared to trust in God. But let's rewind for a moment. What led David to that decisive moment? What gave him the courage to face a giant when everyone else had lost hope? After his conversation with King Saul, David had made up his mind. He would fight Goliath. Saul, still unsure of David's ability to face such a fearsome foe, decided to offer him his royal armor. After all, if David was going to face this massive warrior, he would need all the protection he could get. Saul's armor was the best in the land, strong, heavy, and designed for battle. The king himself had worn it in many fights. But as David tried on the armor, something didn't feel right. The helmet weighed heavily on his head, and the breastplate restricted his movement. The sword hung awkwardly by his side. David moved around in the armor, but he could barely take a step without feeling burdened. He quickly realized that this armor wasn't for him. "I cannot go in these," David said, taking off the armor. "I'm not used to them." To everyone watching, this seemed like a huge mistake. How could David possibly go into battle without any armor? How could he hope to survive, let alone win, against Goliath's massive strength and deadly weapons? But David knew something they didn't. He knew that his victory wouldn't come from armor or swords. It would come from his faith in God. Instead of taking the armor, David relied on what he knew best, his slingshot and a few simple stones. These were the tools he had used time and time again to protect his flock from wild animals, and they were all he needed now. David's confidence didn't come from his weapons or his experience. It came from his unshakable trust in God's power. As David walked toward the battlefield, Goliath was already waiting. The giant stood tall, his massive frame covered in bronze armor, his sword and spear gleaming in the sunlight. Goliath had no fear. He had faced countless enemies before and defeated them all with ease. To him, David was just another victim, a boy who had no idea what he was getting into. But as David stepped forward, something remarkable happened. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He walked toward Goliath with the same calm confidence he had when tending his sheep. The sight was so unexpected, so out of the ordinary, that even Goliath was momentarily taken aback. "What am I, a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" Goliath bellowed, mocking David's youth and lack of armor. The giant's laughter echoed across the valley as he prepared to crush this seemingly insignificant challenger. But David didn't respond with fear. Instead, he looked up at Goliath and spoke words that would soon become legendary. "You come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin. But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The soldiers on both sides could hardly believe what they were hearing. David was speaking to Goliath with the kind of confidence and boldness that even seasoned warriors didn't show. And yet, his words weren't boastful or arrogant. They were filled with a quiet, steadfast faith. David continued, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. It is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Goliath's face twisted with rage. How dare this boy speak to him in such a way? How dare he challenge the might of the Philistines with nothing but faith? Enraged, Goliath took a step forward, his massive form casting a long shadow across the valley. Tension in the air was thick. Everyone watching knew that the moment of truth had arrived. This was it. Confrontation that would decide the fate of two nations. Goliath, the giant who had terrorized Israel for 40 days, stood ready to strike down David in an instant. David showed no fear. With a steady hand, he reached into his pouch and pulled out one of the smooth stones he had gathered earlier. The sound of the slingshot whirring through the air filled the valley. David's aim was perfect, as if guided by an unseen force. The stone flew straight and true, striking Goliath in the center of his forehead. In an instant, the mighty giant staggered. His eyes widened in shock as he stumbled backward. Then, with a thunderous crash, Goliath fell to the ground, defeated. The silence that followed was deafening. No one could believe what had just happened. Goliath, the unbeatable warrior, terror of Israel, had been brought down by a single stone hurled by a young shepherd boy. David ran forward, standing over Goliath's massive body. Without hesitation, he drew Goliath's own sword and cut off the giant's head, just as he had promised. The victory was complete. David had triumphed not by might or strength, but by faith. Philistine army, once so confident in their champion, was now in chaos. They turned and fled in terror, realizing that their greatest weapon had been destroyed. The Israelites, emboldened by David's victory, charged after them, driving the Philistines back and securing a decisive victory. And so the battle that had once seemed hopeless was won. David, the unlikely hero, had faced a giant and prevailed. But more than that, David had shown the world that with God on your side, even the greatest of challenges can be overcome. Lessons from David's victory over Goliath wasn't just a moment of triumph on the battlefield. It was a powerful message that echoed throughout the ages. And today, we're going to unpack the incredible lessons from this story that can help us in our own lives. First and foremost, the story of David teaches us courage. David was not a soldier, nor was he trained to fight giants. He was a young shepherd, used to caring for his sheep and protecting them from wild animals. Yet, when the moment came, David stood up with bravery because he knew something very important. That bravery isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about believing in yourself and having the courage to do what's right, even when it seems impossible. David didn't have armor or a sword, but what he did have was even more powerful: faith in God. David knew that God was with him, and this gave him the strength to face Goliath without fear. When we trust in God, we can face the biggest challenges in our lives, no matter how scary they might seem. Whether it's a big test at school, making new friends, or standing up for someone, we can be brave like David, knowing that we are never alone. Now let's talk about confidence. David's confidence didn't come from how strong or skilled he was, it came from knowing who was on his side: God. Sometimes we might feel like we're not enough or that we can't do something because it feels too hard. But, just like David, we can remember that when we have faith and work hard, we're capable of amazing things. Even if the world tells us we're too small or not good enough, we can prove them wrong by trusting in our abilities and relying on God. Another important lesson from David is about being yourself. When King Saul tried to give David his armor and sword, David refused. He knew that he didn't need those things to win the battle. All he needed was his sling and the stones he was familiar with. This teaches us that we don't need to be like everyone else to succeed. God made each of us unique, and the special gifts and talents we have are enough. We don't have to change who we are to face our challenges. We just need to use what God has already given us. Let's also talk about standing up for what's right. Goliath was making fun of the Israelites, and even though David was young and didn't have to get involved, he knew that he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Sometimes, doing the right thing means taking a stand, even when it's hard or when others don't believe in us. David's brothers and even the soldiers didn't think he could defeat Goliath, but David didn't let that stop him. He trusted in God and stood up for what was right. This is a lesson we can all take with us. When we know something is right, we should stand up, even if it's tough. Finally, the story of David reminds us that with God, all things are possible. No one thought David could defeat Goliath, not even Goliath himself. But with God's help, David was able to do the impossible. When we face big challenges in life, we can remember that we don't have to do it alone. God is always with us, ready to help us through every battle we face. So whether you're facing something scary or difficult, remember this. You can be brave like David. You can trust in God, believe in yourself, and know that you are enough just as you are. No giant is too big when you have faith. So what have we learned from the amazing story of David and Goliath? It's a story of courage, faith, and trusting in something greater than ourselves. But more than that, it's a story that reminds us that no matter how big the challenge, no matter how scary the giant, we can face it with confidence, because we are not alone. David's story teaches us that we don't have to be the biggest, strongest, or most powerful person to make a difference. All we need is the courage to believe in ourselves and the faith, trust that God is guiding us every step of the way. Whether it's standing up to a bully, trying something new, or facing a fear, we can all be brave like David when we trust in God. As you go through life, remember David's example. You don't need to wear someone else's armor to win your battles. Just be yourself. Use the talents and abilities that God has given you, and have faith that you are capable of amazing things. When we believe in ourselves and trust in God, there's no limit to what we can achieve. Let David's victory over Goliath inspire you. Let it remind you that no challenge is too big and no dream is too far out of reach. Even when things seem tough or impossible, remember that with God on your side, you can overcome any giant that comes your way. And before we go, here's a little challenge for you. The next time you face something that feels like a Goliath in your life, stop for a moment and think about how David handled his giant. Take a deep breath, have faith in yourself, and trust that God is with you. You can do it. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you loved hearing the story of David and Goliath and learned some valuable lessons along the way. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories and lessons that you can apply in your life. Remember, be brave, have faith, and trust in God. See you next time.